The boy was building his own coffin. That was the consensus in the small, hard-bitten settlement of Cutter's Gap. Everyone who passed the old Thorne property, a small, undesirable plot of land wedged into the valley's narrowest point, saw the same thing. They saw 17-year-old Elias Thorne, orphaned and new to the valley, committing an act of profound foolishness. He was not building on the small, clear patch of meadow his grandfather had left him. He was not building on the gentle rise that offered a view and good drainage. Instead, he was building between the trunks of 4 ancient fir trees, a cluster so old and massive they were known collectively as the Four Sisters. They stood in a rough diamond formation, each trunk a fortress of bark and wood, nearly 6 feet thick. The space between them was barely 12 feet by 14 feet. It was a dark, root-snarled patch of ground where nothing but moss grew, and it was here that Elias dug his foundation. The men of the valley, practical men who understood the physics of wood and weather, would stop their wagons on the road below and watch. They would shake their heads, a slow, pitying motion. The roots will heave that floor inside a year, one would say, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. The snow load from those branches will crush it flat, another would add. If the wind doesn't drive a trunk right through his bed first, a third would conclude. The wind comes down that valley like a freight train. It was a known fact, a law of nature as certain as the sunrise. To build in the open was a challenge. To build between 4 massive sails designed by God to catch that wind was suicide. The leader of this chorus of disapproval was Silas Blackwood. He was a man built like the oak trees he felled, with a face mapped by 60 years of sun and frost. His farm was the largest in the valley, his barn the sturdiest, his word respected as gospel. He had built half the structures in Cutter's Gap, and none had ever failed. He watched Elias for a week, his patience wearing thin with every misplaced stone and oddly angled post. The boy was not just a fool, he was a stubborn one. Finally, Silas could bear it no longer. He marched up the muddy track to the construction site, his heavy boots sinking into the damp earth. Elias did not stop his work. He was setting a short, thick log, notched with painstaking precision, between the trunks of the 2 northernmost trees. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, his thin frame belying a wiry strength. "Boy," Silas's voice boomed, a sound accustomed to commanding men and livestock, "what in God's name do you think you're doing?" Elias finished settling the log, tapping it with a mallet until the sound it made was a dull, solid thud. Only then did he turn. His eyes were a pale, steady gray, and they met Silas's gaze without fear or deference. "I'm building my home, Mr. Blackwood." "You're building a tomb," Silas corrected, gesturing with a thick finger at the encroaching trees. "These firs will be your pallbearers. The first big wind they'll sway. They'll squeeze this little box of yours like a grape. The wood will groan, the nails will pop, and the whole thing will come down on your head." Elias wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty hand. "They won't sway that much," he said, his voice soft but firm. Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I've been logging this valley since before your father was born. I've seen trees like this go down in a summer squall. In a winter gale they move 10 feet at the crown. That translates to 2 feet of movement right here. 2 feet, boy. Your walls will be splinters." Elias simply looked at the trees, a strange, knowing expression on his face. He ran a hand over the rough bark of the nearest fir. "They're stronger together," he said. It was not an argument. It was a statement of fact. Silas shook his head, his face a mask of exasperation. "This is foolishness. Tear it down. I'll help you build proper on the meadow. A boy alone needs guidance." "I appreciate the offer," Elias said, turning back to his work, "but I'm building here." The finality in his tone closed the conversation. Silas Blackwood stood for a long moment, watching the boy hoist another log, his disbelief curdling into a dark, simmering anger. The boy was not just a fool, he was an arrogant one. The work was slow and brutal. Elias had no horse, no ox, just his own muscles and a set of old tools he'd found in his grandfather's chest. The chest had contained something else, too. A leather-bound journal, its pages filled with a spidery script and detailed technical drawings. It was his grandfather's record of a life spent building in the old country, a land of mountains far fiercer than these. The journal was his blueprint, his Bible. It spoke of principles the men of Cutter's Gap had never heard of. It spoke of symbiotic architecture, of building with the forest, not just in it. His grandfather wrote of the thermal mass of living wood. "The earth remembers warmth," one passage read. A great tree is a conduit of that memory. Its roots dive deep into the soil that never truly freezes, and that deep, slow warmth is drawn up through the trunk, a constant, gentle heat that defies the winter air. A house built against stone will be cold as the stone. A house built against a living tree will share its life. He wrote of wind dynamics. A single structure is an obstacle to the wind. It must fight the gale alone. But a small house nestled between giants is invisible. The wind breaks against the great trunks far above, its force dissipated into the sway of 1,000 branches. The air at the forest floor is a place of calm. The giants take the blows, and the child in their arms is safe. The drawings showed exactly how to do it. The foundation was not a rigid square, but a series of deep, independent stone piers, one for each corner, allowing the ground to heave with the frost without breaking the floor. The walls were not nailed to the trees, a mistake that would kill them and doom the structure. Instead, they were fitted into channels carved into the thick bark, sealed with a flexible mixture of pine pitch and wool that allowed for movement. The trees were not just walls, they were the main support beams. Every morning, Elias rose before the sun, his hands raw, his back a knot of aching muscle. He cut smaller pines from the thick woods behind the construction site, limbing them and dragging them himself. He learned the language of his axe and adze, the heft and swing becoming an extension of his own body. He worked through the autumn chill, his breath pluming in the air, his only companion a scruffy, one-eyed stray dog he'd named Fen. Fen had appeared one day, a ghost of fur and bone, drawn by the smell of Elias's meager cooking fire. Elias had shared his bread and bacon, and the dog had stayed. He became a silent partner in the work, watching from a patch of sun, offering a companionable whine when Elias slumped in exhaustion, and growling low in his chest whenever Silas Blackwood or the other men came too near. The cabin took shape, a strange, organic structure that seemed to grow out of the forest floor. It was small, just a single room. The north and west walls were the living trunks of the 2 largest firs, their bark exposed to the inside. The south and east walls were built of carefully fitted logs, chinked with moss and mud. The roof was the most peculiar part. It was steeply pitched, far steeper than any in the valley, and covered in thick, hand-split cedar shakes. But above it, Elias began constructing a second roof. This drew fresh scorn from the road. A double roof. The boy was certifiably insane. "Wasting good cedar," they muttered. "The weight will bring the whole thing down before the snow even flies." But the journal had been clear. "Snow is 2 things," his grandfather wrote. "It is weight, and it is a blanket. The first roof, the steep one, sheds the weight. It is the muscle. The second roof, built a foot above the first, and with a gentler slope, catches the snow. It holds the blanket. The air trapped between the 2 roofs becomes a space of perfect insulation, warmed by the house below, chilled by the snow above. It is a barrier that no frost can cross." He built it exactly as the drawing showed, a framework of light poles supporting a covering of more cedar shakes. From a distance, it looked like the cabin was wearing a ridiculous, oversized hat. As the first frosts began to bite, Silas Blackwood returned. This time he was not alone. He brought with him the town reeve and another major landowner. They stood, arms crossed, their faces grim and official. "Elias," Silas began, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries, "this has gone on long enough. You are a danger to yourself. This thing, you've built is an affront to common sense." "It's my land," Elias said simply, not looking up from the stone hearth he was carefully constructing against the eastern log wall. "It's land in this valley," the Reeve countered, "and we have standards. Your structure is unsound. When it collapses, we'll be the ones digging your body out. We don't want that trouble." The third man, a rancher named Croft, whose land bordered Elias's, stepped forward. "Look, son, your grandfather was a good man, but he was an odd one. Left you this worthless scrap of land. It's no place for a home. I'll give you a fair price for it, $50. You can take that, move into town, get a proper job." $50 was an insult. The land, small as it was worth 5 times that. It was a transparent attempt to bully him out. Elias placed another stone, testing its fit. He could feel Fenn's low growl vibrating through the floorboards. He finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over the 3 powerful men. "No," he said. "Don't be a fool, boy." Silas's temper snapped. "There's a winter coming that will peel the bark off the trees. I've seen the signs. The squirrels are hoarding twice the nuts. The geese flew south a month early. This valley is going to be buried. Your little shack will be crushed, or you'll freeze in the dark. Take the money and live." "I'll be fine," Elias said. He turned back to his hearth, his posture one of dismissal. The men left, their voices a low rumble of anger and frustration. As they walked away, Elias saw someone else watching from the road. It was Anya, the blacksmith's daughter. She was his age, with quiet eyes and hands that were, like his own, calloused from hard work. She did not mock. She did not pity. She just watched, her expression one of intense, unreadable curiosity. She was the only one. The first test came in early November. A cold snap, born in the far north, descended on the valley without warning. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single afternoon. The wind howled, not a gale, but a persistent, biting force that found every crack and crevice in the valley's homes. Inside his cabin, Elias lit a small fire in his new hearth. The stone, sourced from the riverbed, drew the heat beautifully. The chimney, built with a clever draft design from the journal, sent smoke straight up without a single puff back into the room. He sat on his simple cot, Fenn curled at his feet, and listened to the wind. He could hear it, a high, lonely scream as it tore through the crowns of the 4 sisters far above him. But inside the cabin the air was still. The massive trunks did not move. They did not creak or groan. They stood as silent and solid as mountains, and the space between them was an island of calm. The cabin was warm, shockingly warm. The heat from the small fire seemed to be held and amplified by the room itself. The exposed bark of the firs was warm to the touch, a deep living warmth that radiated into the small space. Elias banked the fire with just 2 logs, enough to last the night. The temperature inside held steady. The next day, in town for supplies, he heard the complaints. "Burned half a cord of wood last night just to keep the chill out," one man grumbled at the general store. "Woke up with ice on the inside of the windows," said another. Silas Blackwood was there. He saw Elias, and his expression soured. "Still alive, boy? I'm surprised a stiff breeze didn't knock over your pile of sticks." Elias just nodded, paid for his flour and salt, and left. But on his way out, Anya was there, holding a basket of iron hinges she was delivering for her father. "Was it cold?" she asked, her voice soft. "No," Elias replied. "It was warm." She looked at him, then at the snow-dusted peaks that loomed over the valley. "My father says the iron is brittle this year. He says it's a sign of a deep cold to come." She paused. "Be careful, Elias." It was the first time anyone in Cutter's Gap, besides the men trying to buy his land, had used his name. The valley had one other prophet. They called him Old Man Hemlock. He was a trapper who lived so far up the mountains he was considered more a part of the landscape than the community. He came down only twice a year to trade his pelts. He arrived in late November, his face hidden under a rime of ice and a thick beard. his eyes the color of a winter sky. He stood in the center of the store, sniffing the air like a bear. "The White Death is coming," he announced to the room. His voice was a dry rustle, like leaves skittering over ice. "I saw the snow hares have already turned. The ptarmigan haven't come down from the peaks. The ice on the high lakes is 4 feet thick already. This won't be a winter. It will be a reckoning." The men laughed nervously. Old Man Hemlock was known for his dramatic pronouncements. "We'll manage, Hemlock," Silas Blackwood said, clapping the old trapper on the shoulder. "We've got strong backs and thick walls in this valley." Hemlock's gaze fell on Silas, and there was no warmth in it. "Your walls are stone and wood, Blackwood. They are dead things. The frost has no respect for the dead." He turned and left, a fleeting ghost of winter, leaving a chill in the room that had nothing to do with the temperature. The storm came on the winter solstice. It began not with snow, but with a silence. The air grew heavy, still, and unnaturally warm. The sky turned a strange, bruised yellow. Elias, splitting his last logs for the winter, felt it. Fen felt it too, whining low and pressing against his leg. Elias checked his stores, brought in extra water, and secured the heavy wooden shutter over his single window. He trusted the signs. He trusted the journal. Then the temperature dropped. It did not fall. It plummeted. It was as if a door to a frozen hell had been thrown open. The air went from 30 degrees to 0 in an hour. By nightfall, it was 20 below. The wind arrived with it, a low moan at first, then a rising shriek, then a physical roar that shook the very bones of the mountains. The snow came last. It was not flakes. It was a solid, blinding wall of white, driven sideways by the wind. It was a horizontal blizzard. Inside his cabin, Elias lit his fire. The wind was a physical presence outside, a monster trying to claw its way in. He could hear the titanic battle being waged 100 feet above his head, the groaning of a billion needles, the straining of ancient limbs. But down at the base of the trunks, nothing moved. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the crackle of the fire. He laid his hand against the inner bark of the western fir. It felt warm, steadfast, alive. The cold could not touch it. The earth remembers warmth. He added one more log to the fire and settled in to wait. For Silas Blackwood, the world was ending. His farmhouse, the pride of the valley, was under siege. It was a large 2-story building made with massive oak beams he had cut and cured himself, with stone walls 2 feet thick. It was a fortress, and it was failing. The wind came down the valley and hit his house like a battering ram. It was a solid, unrelenting force that screamed through every invisible crack. The windows rattled, threatening to shatter. The doors bowed inward. A fine, persistent dusting of snow was being driven straight through the walls, coating every surface in a layer of white frost. His wife and 2 young children were huddled by the great stone fireplace, wrapped in every blanket they owned. But the fire itself seemed to be cowering. The wind, howling down the massive chimney, was sucking the heat straight out of the room. The stone of the hearth was cold to the touch. The frost has no respect for the dead. Then came the sound. A deep, groaning crack from the ceiling. Silas looked up. One of the main ridge beams, a piece of oak a foot square, was visibly bowing under the weight of the snow on the roof. Snow was not supposed to accumulate in a wind this strong. It was supposed to be scoured away. But this was no ordinary snow. It was heavy and wet, and the wind was plastering it to the roof like mortar, feet thick in a matter of hours. Another crack, louder this time. A spider web of fractures appeared in the plaster ceiling. His daughter began to cry. "We need to go to the root cellar," his wife Mary said, her voice tight with fear. "We'll freeze down there," Silas snapped. But he knew she was right. It was that or be crushed. As they gathered their lanterns, a third sound came, a final percussive crack like a rifle shot, followed by a splintering roar. The great oak beam gave way. A section of the roof collapsed inward, and the storm entered the house. Snow, wind, and crushing cold poured in like water through a broken dam. The fire was extinguished in a hissing cloud of steam. The lanterns were blown out. They were plunged into a roaring, freezing darkness. They scrambled for the cellar, Silas grabbing his son, Mary her daughter. They made it to the heavy door and stumbled down the stone steps just as more of the roof gave way above them. They were alive. They were trapped. And they were freezing. The cellar offered protection from the wind, but it was as cold as a tomb. The temperature was already dropping below zero. They would not last the night. In that frozen darkness, huddled with his shivering family, Silas Blackwood faced the ruin of his pride. His home, his masterpiece, was destroyed. His family was going to die. And the only thing he could think of was the fool boy in his ridiculous shack. The boy nestled between the trees. He had two choices: stay here and die with certainty, or try to reach the boy's cabin. It was a quarter-mile away, through the teeth of the worst storm in living memory. It was a suicidal gamble, but it was a gamble. "Mary," he said, his voice hoarse, "we have to go." "Go where? We'll die out there," she sobbed. "To the Thorn place," he said. "To the boy's cabin." The silence that followed was filled with the roar of the storm. The absurdity of it was absolute. Seeking shelter in the one structure everyone knew was a death trap. But their own fortress was gone. Pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. They found a coil of rope. Silas tied it around his waist, then his wife's, then the children's. If one fell, they would all fall together. He grabbed a heavy iron pry bar. He would need it for the cellar door, now buried under tons of snow and wreckage. It took him 10 minutes of desperate, agonizing effort to force it open a crack wide enough to squeeze through. The moment they emerged, the storm hit them. It was not wind. It was a physical wall. It stole their breath and blinded them. The snow was waist-deep, a churning liquid sea of white. The temperature was a physical pain, burning their exposed skin. Silas knew, with the certainty of a woodsman, that it was 40 below zero, or colder. Survival in such conditions was measured in minutes. He led the way, a human snowplow, his family stumbling behind him. He could not see, he could not hear anything but the storm. He navigated by instinct, by the memory of the land slope, heading for the cluster of ancient firs that had been a landmark in this valley for centuries. It was an eternity of frozen agony. He fell, was pulled up by the rope, and staggered on. He felt the tug as his son went down, and he hauled him back to his feet, screaming encouragement that was instantly ripped away by the wind. He was losing. His strength was failing. The cold was sinking into his bones, a deep, final lethargy. And then he ran into it. He didn't see it. He literally collided with a wall of solid wood. For a terrifying moment, he thought he'd gone in a circle and run into the ruins of his own barn. But he reached out a frozen glove and felt the deep vertical grooves of bark. Fir bark. He had made it. He stumbled along the wall, searching for a door, his family huddled behind him like freezing chicks. He found the frame, the wood smooth under his glove. He pounded on it, a weak, desperate drumming. "Hello!" he screamed, his voice a pathetic croak. "Help us!" For a moment there was nothing. Then a bar scraped inside, and the door swung open. Light and heat spilled out into the blizzard. It was like opening the door to summer. Standing in the doorway was Elias Thorne, holding a lantern. His face was calm. Behind him Fenn stood, letting out a single, low woof. Silas Blackwood, the patriarch of Cutter's Gap, the strongest man in the valley, fell to his knees in the snow. His family collapsed around him. Elias did not say a word. He did not ask what they were doing there. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply helped Silas to his feet, then helped him bring his wife and children inside, out of the killing storm. He shut the door, and the world of noise and death vanished. The inside of the cabin was a miracle. It was silent, it was bright, and it was warm. A small, cheerful fire burned in the hearth, yet the room was as warm as a midsummer's day. Silas, his beard caked in ice, his family shivering uncontrollably, could only stare. The air was dry and fresh. The walls of log and living bark radiated a gentle, even heat. There were no drafts, no fine dusting of snow. There was no sense of the apocalyptic storm raging just inches away. Elias gave them blankets and hot broth he had simmering over the fire. He moved with the same quiet efficiency he had shown while building. He was not flustered. He was not surprised. He had expected to be safe. It was an hour before Silas could speak properly, his jaw unlocked from the cold. He looked around the small, warm room, at the massive living trees that formed two of its walls. He looked at the steeply pitched inner roof and the small gap he could see leading to the roof above. He looked at the boy who had saved his family. "How?" Silas finally asked, his voice cracking. "My house. My beams were oak. The walls were stone. It came apart. This place, it's made of sticks. Why is it still standing?" Elias sat down on a small stool, stroking Fenn's head. "Your house fought the storm," he said, his voice even. "So it broke. My house doesn't fight it. It ignores it." He pointed to the massive trunk beside the hearth. "The wind hits the tops of these trees, 150 feet up. They are designed to sway, to shed that force. Down here, at the base, the wind is broken. The trunks are a wall the storm can't move and doesn't notice." He gestured to the ceiling. "The snow load on your roof was immense. My first roof is too steep for snow to stick to. It slides right off. The snow that does get caught is held by the second roof, a foot above. That snow is now a foot-thick blanket of insulation. The deeper the snow, the warmer the cabin becomes." He placed his hand on the bark. "And the trees," he said, a note of reverence in his voice. "Their roots go 30 feet down, into earth that never freezes. They draw that geothermal warmth up into their trunks. They are alive. They are giant, slow-burning furnaces. This cabin isn't being heated by that fire. The fire is just for cooking and light. The cabin is being heated by the forest itself." Silas Blackwood stared, his mind struggling to grasp the elegant, infuriating simplicity of it all. Everything he thought he knew about building, about surviving in this harsh land, was wrong. He had built with dead wood, fighting the valley. This boy had built with living wood, joining it. They stayed in the cabin for 3 days while the blizzard raged. On the second day, there was another desperate pounding at the door. It was the Croft family, their own roof having collapsed. Elias took them in. By the third day, 9 people were sheltered in the tiny cabin, a space no bigger than a woodshed. Yet it was not cramped. It was warm, safe, and filled with the quiet humility of those who had been saved by the very thing they had mocked. When the storm finally broke, the world was remade in white. The snow was 15 feet deep in the valley, drifted to 30 feet against the houses that remained standing. Many did not. Cutter's Gap was devastated. Of the 20 families in the valley, 7 had lost their homes. 4 people had died, frozen in the ruins of their sturdy, sensible houses. The survivors, when they emerged, saw the boys' cabin. It was untouched. The great firs stood serene against the blue sky, their branches heavy with snow. The small structure nestled between them looked as if it had grown there, a natural part of the landscape. It was the only building in the entire valley that showed no signs of damage. Silas Blackwood became the boys' convert. He stood before the remaining townsfolk, his face haggard, but his voice clear. "I was wrong," he said, the words costing him a lifetime of pride. "Everything I told you, everything I knew, was wrong. That boy is not a fool. He's the only one of us who knew how to listen to these mountains. He saved my family. He saved the Crofts. His knowledge saved us." There was no more mockery. There was only awe. That spring the rebuilding of Cutter's Gap began, and it began with Elias Thorne, not as the town fool, but as the master builder. He did not gloat. He did not demand payment. He simply shared the pages of his grandfather's journal, teaching them the principles of building with the land, not against it. They learned to site their homes in the lee of hills and behind natural windbreaks. They learned to build with insulating air gaps and to use the thermal mass of the earth. And they began to plant trees. Around every new foundation, they planted saplings, not for timber, but for life. They were building not just for themselves, but for their grandchildren, creating a legacy of symbiotic architecture that would one day define the entire region. The story jumped forward. Elias Thorne lived a long and full life in the valley. He married Anya, the blacksmith's daughter, the one who had watched with curiosity instead of scorn. They had 4 children who grew up in the little cabin between the trees, which Elias expanded over the years, always following the principles of his grandfather's designs. He became an elder of the town, his advice sought on everything from building to farming to forecasting the weather. He was no longer the outsider, he was the heart of the community. He died peacefully in his 87th year, in the warm cabin he had built with his own 2 hands. The 4 sisters still stood, now impossibly ancient, their massive trunks fused with the walls of the home they had protected for so long. Years later, engineers from a university came to study the unique, resilient architecture of the valley. They brought modern instruments and complex formulas. They measured the wind dynamics, the thermal conductivity of living wood, the insulating properties of snowpack. Their reports, filled with scientific jargon and precise calculations, confirmed everything the old leather journal had said. They called it a revolutionary discovery in sustainable design. On the small, simple gravestone in the town cemetery, beneath the name Elias Thorne, was an epitaph chosen by his wife. It was not a verse from the Bible or a line of poetry. It was just 5 simple words, a testament to a life of quiet wisdom that had saved them all. He listened to the trees,